And good afternoon. We're following breaking news. 2 shootings in suburban Washington this morning. The first, 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, were shot outside a shopping mall in Bethesda, Maryland. All are reportedly in critical condition. The suspect in this shooting remains at large. And there was a second shooting. We want to get the very latest now from NBC's justice correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete, what's the very latest here?
Well, the second shooting was in another shopping center, Aspen Hill, which is also in the suburbs north of Washington in Maryland. And what we're told is that 3 people were shot in the first shooting, which happened at about 11 o'clock this morning at the Westfield Mall in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. We have not been given any updated information about the condition of those 3. Witnesses have said that a man approached a woman as she was getting out of her car in the mall parking lot, asked where she was going. Now, you're looking at pictures of the second scene right now, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the witnesses say the man approached the woman, asked where she was going. They had some brief conversation, and then she was shot. 2 men who responded to help her, who may or may not be, who may have not known her. Now you're looking at the first scene, were also shot. Then about 35 minutes later, 35 to 40 minutes later, in the Aspen Hill shopping center, also in the same, roughly the same northern Washington, Maryland suburbs, the shooting in the second scene, that's the giant supermarket that you were looking at a moment ago. In that parking lot, a woman was killed, and the police have just said that she has died from her wounds. So there are 2 questions going on. I mean, the main question is who's doing this. There are no suspects in custody, although police have said they have a person of interest. But there are 2 questions that police are very actively looking into. The first is, are the 2 shootings today the result of the same person, the same gunman? The 2 scenes are about 10 miles away from each other, about 35 to 40 miles away. Now, that may not seem a long driving distance, but given the traffic in that area and the weather today, you could just make that trip in about 35 to 40 minutes between the Westfield Montgomery Mall and the Aspen Hill Shopping Center, which is some 9 or 10 miles away. So that's one question. The second question, Kristen, is whether these 2 shootings today are related to one that happened last night, also in the Maryland suburbs, in the parking lot of a high school called High Point High School in Beltsville, Maryland. The police there say a man who works for the Federal Protective Service, whom they've identified as Eulalio Tordil, shot and killed a woman that he was involved with in a custody dispute. Someone he knew. This is a woman who worked for the school district. So they've identified a suspect in that shooting, and now they're looking at whether that person is the same person involved in today's shootings. Now, the Federal Protective Service, for those of you not familiar with Washington, is one of the many dozens of federal police forces here in the District of Columbia. They protect diplomatic facilities, so they have that role. We see their patrol cars all over town. The point is that someone who works for them, like he does, who is an officer, would have access to weapons, would have access to bulletproof vests. So they have not said that he is the person of interest in today's shootings, but they have said that they have a person of interest, and that they are closely looking at whether all these shootings are being carried out by the same person. As for why these 2 shootings today, there's absolutely no information on what the motive might be.
And Pete, we understand that some schools in the area have been put on shelter in place, although no schools are on lockdown right now. What can you tell us about that and how the community is responding to this?
Well, that's just a normal kind of response whenever you have a shooting at a scene like this. That's standard procedure to notify schools in the area not to let anybody in case the gunman is going to try to hide in a school or take hostages or that kind of thing. So that's a standard precaution. No indication here that schools are targeted or that there's any reason to believe the suspect has any school intent. other than the obvious one, which was the shooting last night happened in the parking lot of a school, and the victim worked for the school district. But that, from all the indications we got last night from the Prince George's County Police Department, were that this was the shooting last night was part of a custody dispute. It was a domestic incident. It was not a random shooting. What the motive is, or what was going on with today's shootings, whether these victims had anything to do with the person of interest that they've not identified, whether these were random shootings, whether this is someone who wants to have a shootout with police and have this be suicide by cop, we just don't know.
All right, Pete, thank you for that. Stick around, please. I'm going to bring in former FBI profiler Clint Van Sant. Clint, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. At this point, what are you looking at? Pete raises the point, the first thing that investigators are looking into, are these two shootings today related? What are the questions? Who are they talking to right now?
Yeah, I think as Pete and as Jim Kavanaugh suggested earlier, number one, they'll be looking for this Federal Protective Service officer who was involved in this homicide last night. We know that he's a 62-year-old Federal Protective Service officer. He allegedly killed a 44-year-old woman last night, supposedly followed her to the school where this child was, and then gunned her down in the parking lot. So they'll be looking, first of all, that could be logical to connect him with these other two shootings just because of the time frame and the location. So they'll be looking to see if there's any information, anybody they can talk to, number one, can help them find him because of the alleged murder last night, and of course today for the multiple shootings at two different situations. Again, they'll be looking at ballistics to try to suggest, for example, if the same handgun or long gun was used at the two locations today, the location last night. They'll be looking for video. They'll be talking to friends and relatives of the man they know last night was involved in a shooting, as well as looking to see if there's any way they can link these two or these three together. Now, it's a stretch, I think, unless potentially it is what Pete is suggesting, suicide by cop. I've been involved in suicide by cop cases before where individuals, in a case I was involved in, he shotgunned to death his mother and his stepfather, and then he forced us in the course of a bank robbery as FBI agents to kill him. So there are individuals who make a decision they want to die in a fire or shootout, but again, that's something law enforcement has to consider. What it does tell us is if there is one, two, or three different people involved in these shootings, these are dangerous people. They're still on the street, and whether it's one or three, they are very capable of doing something like this again. So I would suggest there's a lot of law enforcement pouring into this rainy, chilled day to try to identify the shooter at the two sites today and to try to apprehend the known shooter from last night.
And I now want to bring in former ATF hostage negotiator and MSNBC contributor Jim Kavanaugh. Jim, thank you for joining our conversation as we continue to follow this breaking news, these two shootings at malls that are in very close proximity. What are the key questions for you right now, and how do they go about tracking down this suspect?
Well, just like Clint outlined, you know, the key thing, Kristen, is to find out, are they linked? Because you had a shooting in Beltsville last night where a woman died. The suspect, a police officer, I mean, that's extremely unusual, police officer for first-degree murder, and he's loose. So that's why, like Clint said, it raises these questions. But they have to just find that out based on the facts. I mean, you also could have that murder, and he could have went off somewhere and committed suicide, or went off and ran off somewhere, and you could have a separate carjacking and shooting in Bethesda. So they have to decide and find that out.
Apologize for interrupting you. Jim, we're going to go to our local reporter now at WRC and watch their broadcast for a few moments.
Suspect walking off. At this point, police are telling us that they have a person of interest, as we've been reporting, but no suspect. So right now, still a very active scene. Police are getting in place, collecting their information, getting things together for an update that we're expecting again here in the next 20 minutes or so. Back to you.
All right, and Jim, I want to go back to you now. We're also hearing that the NIH is on lockdown as well. Go ahead and continue with the thought that you had.
Yeah, well, Kristen, the danger, of course, is someone is loose shooting people in Montgomery County, and, of course, a first-degree murder suspect from Prince George's County in Beltsville loose in the area. So everybody has to kind of have their alert status on and pay attention. Here's two suburban shopping centers, Bethesda and Aspen Hill, where these shootings have occurred. That's unusual enough. So someone, if it's the shooter from Beltsville, someone is trying to rob, carjack, or randomly kill people at these shopping centers. So everybody sort of has to have their game on, pay attention, listen for what law enforcement says. There's going to be a lot of police in the area. They've got to track this guy down. And like Clint said, you know, sometimes these do end by suicide in a vacant lot. You know, it doesn't have to be a suicide by him charging the police. So it's very fluid right now, and the key is to find him before he hurts someone else.
All right, Jim Clint and Pete Williams, thank you for joining us as we continue to track this breaking news, these two shootings at nearby malls in the D.C. area. We will have much more on this coming up right after a very quick break. Stay with us.